And, I wanted to ask a question about kind of you might say, the flavor of international relations at the moment. Because obviously we see a lot of countries, going back and forth with China's relations at the moment. There's a lot of name calling. There's a lot of harsh words being spoken, especially in Australia, since our Prime Minister was pretty much first off the bat in terms of really calling for a serious investigation in China. How do you see this playing out from a diplomatic standpoint?
Well, the diplomacy of Sino-Australian, Sino-American relations is going to determine kind of the future of countries. I mean, right now, half of Washington is preparing for war with China, and the other half of Washington is trying to figure out how to avoid war with China. And the only way to avoid war with China is to engage them diplomatically in terms of trade, COVID-19, technology, and all the rest of it. I mean, it's the diplomatic side of the house that's going to get us out of the other side of the house, which is thinking, if there is a conflict, how long is it going to last and what's going to happen? And none of that is very pleasant. Now, I think we're counting a great deal here. Now, I think a lot of people around the world are trying to make a decision whether to stick with the Americans right now, even though they are retreating, or maybe they might have to cast their lot with someone else, or maybe try to remain neutral. Now, in 1800, the United States is a very fragile democracy. And they got this huge war going on across in Europe and in the New World between revolutionary France and Great Britain. And the Americans had an alliance with the French from the 1770s, 1778. And this alliance was abrogated by the Americans, by John Adams, in 1800 because it was getting the Americans in too much trouble. That is, if the French were to get the Americans involved in a conflict with the British again in, say, the Caribbean, where the Americans would then suffer another war with Britain, which they did not want to handle, by the way, the Americans regarded that as just too onerous. No nation has the right to commit suicide. You got to do what you got to do to survive. And so John Adams, who's a very proud New Englander, he abrogates this treaty with the French. And the decision really is about, do you have a relationship with a country when you sign a treaty, or do you have a relationship with the people who sign the treaty? Well, George Washington made it very clear in his time that it deals with the country, not with the individual people. Originally it was with the King of France, and then it went on to revolutionary France. So the Americans got out in 1800 because they didn't want a war with Britain at that stage, would have broken their backs. Now, in 1812, they had another war of independence with Britain, which nearly broke their backs, but they got lucky again because by this time the British were completely embroiled in war in Europe. So America was able to take care of those distresses. Today, people in Eastern Central Europe, they say, well, should we accommodate Putin or do we hang out with Americans and NATO as defense against this? And this is all about the diplomacy of military relations. And same thing in this part of the world. People say, well, do we have to choose between Washington and Beijing? And it's quite clear that Beijing is never going to invade Australia, but it can make life miserable here through the diplomatic punishment it can impose on Australia by removing its international students, its investments, its tourism, and that kind of thing. I mean, they can starve Australia. What the Australians don't know, of course, is that China needs Australia more than Australia needs China, because the Chinese economy is in such trouble right now. They can't afford to lose anybody. And they can't afford to lose that coal, and they can't afford to lose that iron ore because it can't be replaced anyplace else at this time. Anyway, I think the diplomacy.
Joe, you're whispering there. Am I going to be put on a list after releasing this episode? Am I going to be like on some sort of list?
No. It's just that I was thinking about that today the diplomacy the Chinese diplomacy in America is very important because it's going to determine what happens in trade and technology and overall relations. And there is even a tendency in America now to, there are analysts who are looking for ways to cooperate with Russia, maybe to tilt the balance against China. And they're taking the Atlantic Council in Washington's taking this very serious about what can we offer the Russians to keep the Chinese on their back foot, because Chinese are now seen as America's major strategic, diplomatic, economic, and military rival. And so now we should maybe turn to Russia the way we turned to China in the early 70s, to tilt the balance against Russia. Now, I think that kind of reasoning is very spurious. China has, in terms of, when I look at China, I always say, how many nuclear weapons do they have? They got 260 nuclear warheads. America's got 6,000 nuclear warheads, and the Russians got 6,700. So I don't worry about Chinese diplomacy when I go to bed. I worry about something's going to happen to those weapons in Russia. I mean, are they going to threaten something? Is there going to be an inadvertent launch or something like that? I mean, I'm much more worried about Russia than China. But China right now is the flavor of the day because it's got this great economy, which as a result of COVID-19 is now facing its first negative growth in 50 years. So President Xi has to explain in his own internal way to his population what went wrong. And Donald Trump is saying, and this is what we mean by COVID diplomacy, he's saying that what's happened is a result of the failure of the Chinese, at least to tell people what was going on, and at worst, spreading COVID-19, maybe without realizing it. And some people say that maybe they did realize it. And so this is this COVID diplomacy, whether it's going to accelerate the trends that are going on, or whether it's been factored through the system already. So we got all this diplomacy at high levels, and the diplomacy here will reflect the frameworks that come out of this. Now, can the diplomatic quarrels between America and China right now, can it help solve the problems? Will trade be affected? And of course, economic diplomacy is the number one thing after military diplomacy. I mean, the economic diplomacy is, foreign economic policy is part and parcel of how diplomacy. That's why they say in Australia, it's not the Department of Foreign Relations anymore, but Department of Foreign Affairs. When Australia became a working nation, it was called Department of External Relations, which is a very good way to look at the world. Then it was Department of Foreign Affairs, and then it was Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, because trade is the essential element of economic diplomacy is an essential element in the carrying out of the conduct of diplomacy. Well, that's the story that people tell each other anyway. So yes, I think Chinese diplomacy and how we handle it, how the whole world handles it. Right now, China, despite all their great efforts and their great positive diplomacy, particularly the Belt and Road Initiative, which was seen as an attempt to spread globalization, I think right now that China is sort of looking at this rising tsunami of anti-Chinese feeling and asking themselves, how did it get to this point? And I think diplomacy has a major role to play in the next 5 years about how we get out of this economic slump we're all going to be in, and how we get about solving future problems. You know, the UN pointed out before COVID-19 that there were 37,000 people a day who, out of fear and afraid, left their homes, whether it was Syria, Afghanistan, whatever it was. And today, the UN tells us that 247 million people in the third world, what now called the global south, are marching towards starvation and and poverty. That we have a whole new class of poverty. So this sort of cools the hopes of the Sustainable Development Goals, because they're all going to be set back. And so we're going to have economic diplomacy, we're going to have water diplomacy, security diplomacy, and global warming, and we're going to have, of course, nuclear diplomacy and how we get rid of the war on terror, which is still in the background. So we have that kind of diplomacy going on too. So diplomacy and how we negotiate these things in the years ahead plays a key role. And I'm very happy to say that some of the brightest students I've seen in 45 years have gone on to have diplomatic roles, whether it's Department of Defense, they have a diplomatic role to play, or whether it's foreign affairs and trade, or whether they're analysts, or intelligence operators. These are people who see the outside world and they interpret the outside world for the Australian machinery government to deal with it. So when a prime minister speaks to a Chinese leader or a foreign minister here speaks to their opposite number, they should have on their desk all these particular briefings. I mean, diplomacy sometimes provides a tipping point. There was a famous instance in April 1945. Franklin Roosevelt had died. His position was taken over by this, I'm not going to say relative ingenue. This is Harry S. Truman. Truman knew his way around the world. He just wasn't very sophisticated. And Molotov, the gruff Russian leader, is going to see Truman on his way to the new UN conference in San Francisco. Up to this time, the Soviet Union and the United States were allies, and very few harsh words. No harsh words were spoken. Franklin Roosevelt was going to integrate Soviet war aims that didn't do too much damage into Western war aims. And when Truman succeeded him, Truman was rushed by all these people who had complaints about Roosevelt's policy of appeasement or accommodation. And so Truman asked his State Department for a profile on Molotov, who's coming through. Molotov is going to pay his respects to the new president on his way to San Francisco. And this is after the Soviet government had recognized their own communist cadres in Poland. That is, they were cutting deals with the new Polish government, which was supposed to be with all the allies. That was agreed to at Yalta. So Truman is not quite sure how to treat Molotov. So someone in the State Department writes him a profile about how to treat him, what he might expect, and kind of things he's used to. So Molotov comes to the door, and he says, he welcomes him, or he congratulates him and all that. He brings the words from Stalin. And then Truman rips into him in four-letter words about how this relationship we have is not a two-way street, and that you have to back off the Poles, because there's a lot of Poles who vote in Detroit too, and that's not what we agreed at Yalta. So he's literally taking shreds off this guy based on his State Department memo on how to treat him. So here's a classic example of some Russian expert who thinks he knows Molotov, who thinks that Molotov responds to four-letter words, and Harry S. Truman had a lot of four-letter words coming from Kansas City, Missouri. And Molotov says two things. He said, these are the first harsh words that have been spoken between the Allies since Hitler attacked the Soviet Union in July 41. And at this point, and he also says he's not used to being talked to like that. Now, I find it very hard for a guy who's worked all of his life for Joseph Stalin, who hasn't been talked to like that. Stalin always treated his people like spiders treat flies, they had him in suspense all the time. So as a result of this diplomatic profile, we are now into a full-scale Cold War with the Soviet Union based on this now war of words, which then generates into far more sinister things as we move forward. So this is a good example of how, when I say diplomacy, I'm talking about not only the practitioners and the foreign ministers, I'm talking about the analysts who work on all these various desks and these different regions who provide crucial advice at different times. And so all of these people are part of the diplomatic process. And so there's a classic example. Instead of looking, people think diplomacy is about compromise. Well, actually, it's not. It's about leverage. And Harry S. Truman had a heap of leverage in 1945. The United States was untouched by the Second World War. On the other hand, Molotov had a little bit of leverage too. That is, the Red Army had liberated all the ancient capitals of Eastern and Central Europe. They are in place, and they are there to do one thing, and that is to create a diplomatic, economic, and physical barrier between them and the next German invasions. They didn't trust Germany for the third time around. They wanted to make sure that Eastern and Central Europe at least had a foreign policy that was aligned with Soviet foreign policy. But they got lucky. And when they entered all these countries, they sent in their own teams of people who might have been Poles or Czechs who were trained in the Soviet Union under the days of the Comintern and the international kind of thing. So the Soviets decided to, put out all the lights in Eastern and Central Europe. So that was their leverage. They had physical capture of Eastern and Central Europe. Truman's leverage is he's got all the economic resources in the world to help carve that next new world. And the Soviets got two choices. They can join his version, or they can go doing what they're doing. Well, they went on to do what they were going to do it anyway. But a good example of how a diplomatic analysis shapes the future. Same thing in George Kennan's famous long telegram, where he said that the Soviet Union was, and at this time he's number two man in Moscow, the acting charge, and he says the Soviet Union, in effect, is an ideology in the possession of the state. It's a war. It's a messianic, world-conquering ideology, which is not like Hitler, though. They do stop if you resist them from time to time. And so, and he goes on to give an explanation or a rationale to people in Congress about why they should be hardline Soviets or anti-communists. And of course, you don't need a reason to be anti-communist in America. They're anti-communists since 1917, large sections of the population. So the point is that these diplomats not only provide the practice in various places, they provide the analyses, which then informs an entire country's foreign policy or attitude towards these other nations. And now in this country, I don't see much analysis about the Chinese. I must say, Kevin Rudd, I've been a little disappointed and did a beautiful piece a couple of weeks ago in Foreign Affairs, where he talks about the impact of COVID-19, the diplomacy between China and the United States. And, the story is that one of them is going to be the great winner at the end of all of this. And Rudd says very plainly, that there are no winners here. They'll both be in diminished positions when this is over, which is exactly the answer. Neither one of them has much to brag about right now, and they have a great deal to cooperate about right now. So we need that analysis, which is informed by people who study history, philosophy, literature, and especially diplomatic history.